When my daughter told me my simple life would embarrass her fiancé's family, she didn't know my 30 years as a title examiner gave me access to their darkest secrets. I'm Vivian Carter, 54. She wanted a high society wedding. She's about to get a lesson in who owns the ground she walks on. The tea kettle on my stove has a small, familiar dent on the copper bottom, right where my late husband Thomas dropped it on our first anniversary 32 years ago. It's a cheap little thing, but it heats water just fine. I was holding a faded dish towel, wiping down the yellow laminate countertops of my kitchen in Sandusky, Ohio, when my daughter Chloe delivered the blow. She didn't look at me when she said it. She kept her eyes glued to her iPhone, her thumb flicking past images of designer bridal gowns and floral arrangements that cost more than I made in a year at the county recorder's office. "We just think it's for the best, Mom," Chloe said, her voice carrying a strange, rehearsed flatness. Julian's parents are very private people. They come from a different social circle on Catawba Island. Honestly, they're going to be traveling in Europe during the wedding anyway, so they won't even be attending. There's really no point in trying to force a meeting. It would just be awkward. I stood there, the damp dish towel draped over my hand like a heavy, cold weight. "Awkward, Chloe?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "I'm your mother. I raised you in this house on a single income after your father passed. I spent 30 years squinting at microfeeds and digital land registries to pay for your tuition at Ohio State. And now you're telling me I'm not allowed to meet the people your new family belongs to?" Chloe finally looked up, and I saw the flicker of embarrassment in her eyes, not for herself, but for me. She looked at my faded denim shirt, my unstyled graying hair, and the modest, comfortable living room behind me. "Julian's family has history, Mom," she said, her voice rising in defensive irritation. "They own the Sterling estate. Julian's father is a retired developer. They don't do potlucks and porch chats. If you met them, you'd just feel out of place. And I don't want to spend my wedding rehearsal worrying about you trying to fit in. Just let it go. You'll be at the ceremony, and that's enough. I know some of you reading this have sat at your own kitchen table and felt that exact freezing draft. You spend a lifetime scraping by, skipping new shoes and dental work so your child can have the best, only for them to turn around and treat you like a stain they need to scrub out of their new, shiny life. It's a quiet kind of pain that sits right in the center of your chest, heavy as a stone. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just looked at my daughter, this beautiful young woman I had nurtured, and saw a stranger who had traded her soul for a zip code. "I see," I said softly, folding the dish towel and placing it neatly by the sink. "If that's how you feel, Chloe." She looked relieved, kissing my cheek with a quick, superficial peck before gathering her designer purse and rushing out the door. The screen door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing in the quiet house. The next morning, the IROF Lake Erie was crisp and smelled of damp earth and rotting cedar. I walked into the Ottawa County Courthouse, hanging my cardigan on the peg behind my desk. I've worked in the land registry department since I was 24. I know every parcel of land, every easement, every tax lien, and every historic deed in this county. I can trace a family's fortunes and failures just by looking at the color of the ink on their property filings. My dear friend Clara, who has shared the corner office with me for 25 years, was already sipping her black coffee. She looked at my face and immediately set her mug down. Clara has seen me through Thomas's funeral, through Chloe's teenage tantrums, and through every high and low of my quiet life. She knows my expressions better than anyone. "Vivian," Clara said, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. "You look like you slept on a bed of gravel. What did Chloe do?" I sat down, my fingers tracing the worn edge of my desk calendar. "She told me I can't meet Julian's parents. Said they're high society and won't be at the wedding anyway because they're cruising the Mediterranean. She basically told me I'd embarrass her." Clara scoffed, a sharp, angry sound that made the printer nearby hum in sympathy. "Are you kidding me?" After you worked 50-hour weeks so she could live in that fancy dorm? Who do these Sterlings think they are? I don't care how much lakefront property they own on Catawba Island, nobody treats my Vivian like a second-class citizen. She said they own the Sterling estate, I muttered, staring at my computer screen. The historic stone manor on the East Cliff. Well, yes, Clara said, leaning back in her chair. The big place with the wrought iron gates. But Vivian, rich folks don't skip their only son's wedding for a cruise. That doesn't make a lick of sense. Wealthy people live for showing off their kids' weddings. Something is rotten there. Her words hung in the air, mixing with the smell of old paper and ozone from the copy machine. Clara was right. In my 30 years of examining titles, I've learned that when people try to hide who they are, there is always a paper trail explaining why. I booted up the county's secure property database. My fingers, dry from decades of handling paper, moved over the keyboard with practiced ease. I typed in the name, *Sterling, Richard and Eleanor *. I expected to find a long history of wealth, perhaps a few corporate transfers, or a high-value trust. Instead, what appeared on my screen made my breath hitch in my throat. The Sterling estate on Catawba Island, a beautiful, historic stone mansion overlooking the water, was indeed registered under their names. But as I scrolled down to the active encumbrances and lien registry, the screen filled with red flags. There was a federal tax lien filed 2 years ago for over $80,000. There was a pending civil judgment from a local contractor who hadn't been paid for roof repairs. And then, my eyes locked onto the primary mortgage holder. The property wasn't owned free and clear. It was backed by a massive private secondary mortgage that had been refinanced 3 years ago to stave off a primary foreclosure. I stared at the name of the lending entity listed on the deed of trust. *The Miller Carter Family Trust. My heart stopped. My hand shook so hard I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. The Miller Carter Family Trust was not a corporate bank. It was a private trust, established 40 years ago by my late father, Arthur Miller. He had been a quiet, incredibly frugal land surveyor who bought up cheap parcels of marshland and lakefront property, back in the 50s and 60s, when people thought it was worthless. When he died, he left the management of those properties, and the resulting trust to me, his only daughter. Because I didn't care for luxury, and because I wanted to teach Chloe the value of hard work, I had never touched the principal of that trust. I lived on my title clerk's salary, letting a professional wealth management firm in Cleveland quietly handle the trust's investments and private mortgages. I received a quarterly report in a plain manila envelope, which I always filed away in my cedar lockbox at home without much thought, using only a small portion of the interest to pay off Chloe's college loans. I slowly clicked on the active ledger for the Miller Carter Trust's outstanding loans. There it was, in cold, digital, black and white. Richard and Eleanor Sterling had taken out a private, high-interest bridge loan of $450,000 from my family's trust to keep their estate from being auctioned off on the courthouse steps. And according to the active ledger, they hadn't made a single payment in 7 months. They were in default. In fact, my management firm had issued a final cure notice 30 days ago. The next step, which required my personal signature as the sole trustee, was the execution of a formal foreclosure warrant. The very people my daughter thought were too elite for her working-class mother were currently living in a house that I technically had the legal power to repossess. They weren't traveling the Mediterranean. They were hiding from debt collectors, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of wealth while their entire world crumbled around them. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the office pressing in on me. I looked down at my worn, sensible shoes, then back at the glowing screen. "Vivian?" Clara whispered, leaning over my shoulder. "What is that? What did you find?" I pointed a trembling finger at the screen, at the names of Richard and Eleanor Sterling, and then at the name of the trustee authorized to sign their eviction papers. My own name was printed right there, waiting for my hand to pen the final stroke. Clara's reading glasses slipped completely off her nose, dangling by the beaded chain around her neck. She didn't bother to catch them. She just stared at my computer screen, her breath coming in a short, sharp gasp that seemed to cut through the hum of the office fluorescent lights. "Vivian," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "Tell me I'm misreading this. Tell me your daddy's trust isn't holding the paper on the Sterling estate." I couldn't speak. I just pointed my finger at the screen, tracing the digital letters of my own name listed as the sole trustee of the Miller Carter Family Trust. Below it, the names of Richard and Eleanor Sterling were printed in cold, hard Arial font, right next to the red-flagged delinquency status. They owe $352,000 on the principal, I finally managed to say, my voice sounding incredibly small in the quiet room, plus another $98,000 in accumulated interest and late fees. They haven't made a single payment since last October, Clara. Not one. Clara leaned in closer, her shoulder pressing against mine. And Chloe has no idea. She thinks these people are royalty? She thinks they're the gatekeepers of a world I'm not good enough to look at, I said. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. She thinks they're too busy yachting in the Mediterranean to attend her wedding because they're high society. Meanwhile, they're probably dodging the sheriff's deputy trying to serve them with a summons. Closed my eyes for a brief second, and in the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw my father, Arthur Miller. He was a man who wore the same brown canvas work jacket for 20 years, the cuffs frayed and stained with ditch water from his surveying jobs. He used to sit at our kitchen table with a slide rule and a yellow legal pad, calculating land values while I did my homework. He always told me, Vivian, real wealth doesn't make a sound. It sits quietly in the dirt, waiting. The louder a man talks about what he owns, the more the bank actually owns him. I had lived by those words. I lived in the same modest 3-bedroom ranch house my husband Thomas and I bought in 1992. I drove a 10-year-old Chevy Impala with a steering wheel cover that was starting to peel at the 10 and 2 position. I didn't need luxury. But my daughter Chloe had looked at my simple life and assumed it was the limit of my worth. She had looked at my worn denim shirts and my sensible shoes and decided that her mother was a small, insignificant woman who would embarrass her in front of her new, glittering in-laws. If you've ever had your own flesh and blood look at you with that kind of polite pity, you know how it hollows you out. It's a physical ache, a cold pocket of air right behind your ribs. You want to scream? You want to shake them and remind them of every fever you watched over, every shoe you went without so they could have the name brand sneakers, but you don't. You just hold your breath and let them walk away because you love them too much to show them how deeply they've cut you. But as I stared at that computer screen, the hurt inside me began to shift. It didn't turn into hot anger. It's messy and it makes you sloppy. No, it turned into something cool, heavy, and solid. It turned into resolve. "Clara," I said, my voice steadying, "I need to go home. I need to get the physical files." "Go," Clara said, her hand squeezing my arm with a fierce, protective grip. "I'll cover your desk. If the director asks, I'll tell him you have a sudden case of family business. And Vivian, don't you dare let them slide." I nodded, gathered my cardigan, and walked out of the courthouse. The drive back to my neighborhood was a blur of gray Ohio asphalt and the pale green of early spring leaves. When I let myself into my quiet house, the smell of cinnamon tea from breakfast still hung in the air. I walked straight to the hallway closet, pushed aside the winter coats, and reached for the top shelf. There, tucked behind a stack of old photo albums, was my father's cedar lockbox. It was a heavy, dark box, the wood aromatic and smooth, with his initials, *AM*, hand-carved into the lid. I didn't keep the key in the lockbox itself. I walked to the kitchen pantry, reached behind a dusty can of sliced peaches, and pulled out an old, rectangular metal tin that had once held throat lozenges back in the 70s. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded cotton balls, was the small, brass skeleton key. My hands were steady as I unlocked the cedar box. The lock turned with a solid, satisfying click. Inside were the physical records of the Miller-Carter Family Trust. For 40 years, Vance and Associates, a conservative wealth management firm in Cleveland, had handled the day-to-day operations of the trust. I had given them strict instructions to reinvest the earnings and only distribute what I specifically requested, which was very little. I had used a small portion to pay off Chloe's student loans, letting her believe it was a modest educational grant I had applied for through my work. I hadn't wanted her to feel like a trust fund baby. I wanted her to build a life on her own merit. What a foolish, naive hope that had been. I pulled out the thick, cream-colored folder labeled *Active Private Mortgages*. There it was. The original promissory note signed by Richard Sterling and Eleanor Sterling 3 years ago. They had put up their historic Catawba Island stone manor as collateral for a $450,000 bridge loan. The interest rate was 8.5% high, but standard for a private rescue loan of that nature. I flipped through the pages, reading the precise legal language my father's lawyers had drafted decades ago. There was no leniency built into these documents. If the borrowers defaulted for more than 90 days, the trustee had the immediate unilateral right to accelerate the debt, demand full payment, and, failing that, initiate non-judicial foreclosure proceedings. I picked up my kitchen wall phone and dialed the direct number for Raymond Vance. Raymond had been my father's attorney before he transitioned into wealth management, and he had looked after my financial interests with the loyalty of an old family dog. Vivian, Raymond's deep, gravelly voice came through the receiver, sounding surprised but warm. "It's rare to hear from you on a Tuesday. Is everything all right? I was actually preparing your quarterly report to send out this Friday." "Raymond," I said, sitting down at my laminate kitchen table, my fingers tracing the dented copper bottom of the tea kettle resting on the stove nearby. "I need to ask you about the Sterling loan, the one on the Catawba Island property." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I heard the rustle of paper, then the heavy sigh of a man who had been waiting for this phone call for a very long time. "Ah," Raymond said, "the Sterlings. I was hoping you wouldn't look too closely at that ledger until I had a chance to speak with you. Vivian, they are a disaster. Sterling is a ghost. He's been running a shell game with his development company for 5 years, using new investor money to pay off old debts. This bridge loan was their last gasp to keep that estate." "Why didn't you tell me they were in default?" I asked, my voice dropping. "I sent the formal notices to your P.O. box, as always," Raymond explained gently. "But you've always trusted us to handle the administrative side. We issued the 30-day cure notice last month. It expired last Tuesday, Vivian. Technically, they are in total default. I have the foreclosure warrant sitting on my desk right now, just waiting for your signature. I was going to courier it to you this week. Have they offered any explanation?" I asked. Raymond let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Richard Sterling called me last week. He didn't offer money, he offered excuses. He had the nerve to ask for another 6-month extension. He claimed his son was marrying into a prominent Sandusky family with substantial local holdings, and that they would have the liquidity to settle the debt in full by the end of the summer. He basically hinted that they were baiting a wealthy hook." My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. A prominent Sandusky family. Chloe. They thought Chloe had money. Or rather, Chloe had probably let them believe we were comfortable, perhaps even wealthy in that quiet, old money way, to make herself look better in their eyes. And the Sterlings, desperate and drowning, were clinging to my daughter like a life preserver, while my daughter was throwing her own mother overboard to climb onto their sinking ship. The sheer, tragic irony of it almost made me laugh out loud. "Vivian?" Raymond's voice broke through my thoughts. "Are you there? If you want, I can sign the authorization under my limited power of attorney and initiate the foreclosure immediately. We can have the sheriff's notice posted on their gate by Friday. I looked out my kitchen window. A robin was hopping across my small, neatly mowed lawn, searching for worms in the damp Ohio soil. My house was small. My life was quiet, but it was mine, paid for with honest work and clean hands. "No, Raymond," I said softly, my voice carrying a weight I hadn't felt in years. "Don't sign it yet. Send the physical documents to me. I want the original default notices, the loan agreement, and the foreclosure warrant. Send them by courier to my office at the courthouse tomorrow morning." "Vivian, what are you planning?" Raymond asked, a note of caution in his tone. "Richard Sterling can be very manipulative if he realizes who you are." "That's exactly what I want, Raymond," I interrupted, my voice as cool and steady as the lake breeze. "I want him to realize exactly who I am." I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. There was a text message from Chloe from an hour ago. It was a photo of a bridal bouquet, white orchids and calla lilies. Below it, she had written, "Julian's mom says white orchids are the only acceptable choice for a late spring wedding. They're importing them from Hawaii." So elegant. I didn't reply. I just stared at the screen, at the name of the girl I had carried under my heart. The girl who was currently letting a bankrupt stranger dictate her life while she locked her own mother out of the room. I stood up, walked back to the hallway closet, and retrieved a worn, brown leather folder that had belonged to my late husband, Thomas. He had used it to keep his plumbing invoices organized. It was scuffed at the corners, smelling faintly of old paper and the copper pipes he used to work on. I placed the trust documents inside it, sliding the zipper shut with a slow, deliberate pull. Tomorrow I would receive the foreclosure papers. And then I would make a little trip to Catawba Island. I wanted to see this high society family for myself. I wanted to see the people my daughter thought were too good for a Sandusky title clerk. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, the quiet strength of my father's legacy wrapping around me like a warm blanket. The heavy cardboard overnight envelope sat on my desk at the Ottawa County Courthouse, its red and blue overnight delivery logo looking stark and demanding against the pale green laminate. Clara didn't say a word. She just reached over and slid a silver letter opener across my desk calendar, her eyes fixed on me with a quiet, fierce intensity. My fingers were slightly cold as I picked up the metal blade and sliced through the top of the envelope. Inside was a thick, blue-backed legal document, fresh from Raymond Vance's office in Cleveland. I pulled it out, the high-grade paper crisp and heavy under my fingertips. There it was. The formal * notice of acceleration and intent to foreclose *. My name, Vivian Miller Carter *, was printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the signature line, designated as the sole trustee of the Miller Carter Family Trust. Behind it were the certified copies of the default notices, the 3-year-old promissory note, and the payment ledger showing a string of zeros stretching back to last autumn. "Is that it?" Clara whispered, leaning over her desk, her voice barely carrying over the low hum of the office copy machine. "It's all here," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "The cure period has legally expired. They owe the full balance immediately. If they can't produce $450,000 plus $98,000 in interest and penalties within 30 days, the property goes to a sheriff's sale on the courthouse steps." Before Clara could reply, the screen of my personal cell phone lit up on my desk, buzzing against the wood. The caller ID showed Chloe's name, accompanied by a little photo of her laughing on a sale-bought photo Julian had taken last summer. I looked at Clara. She gave me a slow, encouraging nod. I picked up the phone and swiped the screen. "Hello, Chloe." "Mom?" Her voice was frantic, filled with the high-pitched, breathless energy she always carried when she was overwhelmed by her own choices. "Oh, thank goodness you answered. I'm at the bridal boutique in Rocky River and there's a massive issue. The venue coordinator for the yacht club rehearsal dinner just called. They need the second deposit by 5 o'clock today, or they're going to release our date." I leaned back in my chair, my eyes resting on the blue-backed foreclosure warrant in front of me. I thought Julian's family was handling the venue arrangements. Chloe, you told me his father was a private developer with deep roots on the island. There was a brief, telling pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the rustle of silk hangers and the distant, polite murmur of a bridal consultant. When Chloe spoke again, her voice had dropped to a defensive, hushed whisper. They are, Mom. It's just, Julian's dad is having some temporary wire transfer issues. You know how international banks are. Most of their capital is tied up in European holdings right now because of their travel schedule, and the time difference is making everything take forever. It's just $5,000. I was wondering, could you transfer it to my account from your savings? Just as a short-term loan? Julian says his father will reimburse us the second their offshore accounts clear next week. Asterisk offshore accounts. International banks. Asterisk. If you've ever had to hold your tongue while your own child spun a web of lies to fit in with people who wouldn't buy her a glass of water if she was on fire, you know the taste of that silence. It's like copper, metal, and cold. I sat there in my sensible cardigan, in my quiet county office, listening to my daughter use the vocabulary of wealth she didn't possess to cover for a family of bankrupt grifters who were currently using her as a shield against my own law firm. $5,000 is a lot of money for a title clerk, Chloe, I said softly, keeping my voice mild, playing the part she had written for me. I know, Mom, I know, she hissed, her irritation breaking through the sweetness. But this is my wedding. If we lose the yacht club, Julian's family will be mortified. They have a reputation to maintain on the island. Please, Mom. I'll make sure Julian's dad pays you back the minute they get back from Europe, I promise. All right, I said, my heart breaking a little more for the girl she used to be. The little girl who used to be thrilled with a $5 box of saltwater taffy from the Sandusky Pier. I'll transfer the money to your account this afternoon. Oh, thank you. You're the best, Mom. Truly, she gasped, her relief palpable. I have to go. The seamstress is waiting. I love you. The line went dead. I set the phone down on top of the legal documents. I didn't cry. I had cried enough tears over the years, and none of them had ever cleared a title or paid a debt. They're bleeding her dry, Vivian, Clara said, her voice thick with anger. They're using that poor girl's desperation to scrape up pocket change while they dodge a $500,000 foreclosure. They're not just bleeding her, Clara, I said, sliding the blue-backed documents into the worn, brown leather folder that had belonged to my late husband, Thomas. They're trying to bleed me. They think Chloe's prominent Sandusky family is going to bail them out. They think they've found a soft landing. I stood up, smoothing the front of my denim shirt. I'm taking the rest of the afternoon off, Clara. I have a delivery to make. You going to Catawba Island? Clara asked, her eyes wide. I am, I said, zipping the leather folder shut. It's time to see what $450,000 of my father's hard work actually bought. The drive out to Catawba Island took 20 minutes. I drove my 10-year-old Chevy Impala across the bridge, the cold spring wind off Lake Erie, buffeting the side of the car. The water was a slate gray today, capped with white foam, matching the heavy clouds hanging low over the peninsula. As the road transitioned from the modest, vinyl-sided cottages of the mainland to the sprawling, gated properties of the island, the change was stark. The lawns here were manicured, even in the early spring, surrounded by high privacy hedges and stone walls. I found the address, Islay. The Sterling estate sat on the eastern cliff, overlooking the open water. A pair of grand, wrought-iron gates guarded the entrance, flanked by stone pillars. But as I pulled my Impala up to the call box, my title examiner's eye began to notice the small, telling details that casual visitors always missed. The gold leaf on the Sterling Manor plaque was peeling, showing green oxidation underneath. The gravel driveway was thin, with patches of black landscape fabric showing through where new stone hadn't been laid in years. And the grand, double-hung windows of the stone mansion were dark, the heavy drapes drawn tight to keep the heat in or perhaps to keep the world out. I didn't press the call button. The gates were slightly ajar, the electronic arm deactivated. I drove my modest sedan right through, the tires crunching loudly on the sparse gravel. I parked in the circular driveway, right in front of the massive oak front doors. I grabbed the brown leather folder from the passenger seat, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the cold lake wind. As I walked up the stone steps, I noticed a small yellow sticker tucked into the corner of the doorframe. A final notice from the local gas company. They hadn't paid their utility bill. The grand illusion was rotting from the edges, and my daughter was desperately trying to paint over the mold. I knocked on the heavy brass knocker. The sound echoed loudly through the quiet portico. A moment later, the door creaked open. The woman who stood before me was Eleanor Sterling. Recognized her from the social column clippings Chloe had left on my kitchen table. She was in her late 50s. Her blonde hair styled in a stiff, expensive bob that was overdue for a root touch-up. She wore a cream cashmere sweater that looked soft but was slightly pilled at the elbows, and her fingers were heavy with diamonds, though I noticed her manicure was chipped. She looked at me, her eyes sweeping over my denim shirt, my practical canvas jacket, and the worn leather folder in my hand. Her expression hardened instantly into the cold, dismissive look reserved for solicitors and delivery people. "Yes?" she asked, her voice carrying a sharp, aristocratic drawl. "If you're here about the landscaping, my husband is currently handling those accounts. We are not accepting unscheduled visits." "I'm not here about the landscaping, Mrs. Sterling," I said, keeping my voice calm, polite, and completely level. "My name is Vivian Carter. I'm here on behalf of the Miller Carter Family Trust." The change in her demeanor was instantaneous. The haughty condescension flickered, replaced by a sudden, sharp panic that she tried desperately to mask with a tight, brittle smile. "Oh," she said, her hand fluttering to her throat. The trust." "Yes, of course. Richard," she called out into the dark hallway behind her. "Richard, come here. Someone from the Vance office is here." A tall, silver-haired man appeared in the foyer. Richard Sterling looked exactly like the developer he claimed to be, wearing a tailored blazer and leather loafers. But his face was lined with the deep, gray exhaustion of a man who spent his nights calculating how to outrun his debts. "What is this?" Richard asked, stepping forward, his voice loud and demanding, an obvious attempt to control the room before he even knew who was in it. "We were told by Raymond Vance that we would have until the end of the month to present our restructuring proposal. Why are you showing up at our private residence?" "I'm here to deliver the formal notice of acceleration, Mr. Sterling," I said, opening the leather folder and pulling out the blue-backed documents. I held them out to him. "The cure period expired last Tuesday. The trust is demanding full payment of the outstanding $548,000, effective immediately." Richard didn't take the papers. He stared at them as if they were covered in poison. "This is ridiculous," Eleanor chimed in, her voice rising in pitched irritation. "Do you know who we are? We have lived on this island for 30 years. We are currently preparing for our son's wedding. We cannot be bothered with these administrative errors right now." "It's not an error, Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice remaining as steady as the stone steps beneath my feet. "Your account has been in active default for over 7 months. The trustee has declined to grant any further extensions." Richard stepped closer, his chest swelling as he tried to intimidate me. "Listen to me, young lady," he said, ignoring the fact that I was easily in my 50s. "I don't care what some clerk in Cleveland wrote down. My son is marrying into a very prominent, very wealthy family from Sandusky in 3 weeks. The wedding is a private, high-society affair. Once that merger is complete, we will have more than enough liquidity to settle this minor bridge loan in full. You tell your supervisor that if they push this foreclosure, they will be alienating some of the most influential people in this county." He stood there looking down his nose at me, completely unaware of the absolute absurdity of his words. He was trying to use my own family's imagined wealth to threaten me into letting him keep the house I owned, all while my daughter was currently transferring $5,000 of my hard-earned savings just to keep his son's rehearsal dinner from being canceled. I looked at Richard Sterling. Then I looked at Eleanor. The sheer, monumental weight of their arrogance sat between us on the cold stone porch. And in that moment, the last lingering trace of hesitation in my heart simply evaporated. "I see," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, freezing clarity. "A prominent Sandusky family. And you expect this marriage to solve your financial difficulties? It is a highly advantageous union for both parties," Eleanor said loftily, her chin tilting up. "Now, take your papers and leave. We have international travel plans to finalize, and we do not have time for this." I didn't argue. I didn't reveal my identity. I simply placed the blue-backed documents on the small wicker table next to the front door, weighting them down with a heavy, decorative stone shell that sat nearby. "The notice has been legally served, Mr. Sterling," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "And as for your international travel, I suggest you stay close to home. The trustee has scheduled a mandatory personal inspection of the property to assess the collateral value before the public auction." Richard sneered. "We won't be here. We are traveling." "I think you will be," I said softly. I turned and walked down the steps, my sensible shoes clicking firmly on the stone. Behind me, I heard the heavy oak door slam shut with a hollow, echoing boom. I got back into my Chevy Impala, my hands perfectly steady as I gripped the steering wheel. I looked up at the grand, decaying stone facade of the Sterling estate in my rearview mirror as I backed out of the driveway. They thought they were the royalty of Catawba Island. They thought my daughter was their golden ticket. And they thought her mother was a quiet, insignificant woman who would disappear into the background. They were about to learn that the ground beneath their feet didn't belong to them anymore. I transferred the $5,000 to Chloe's account at exactly 2 o'clock that afternoon. I sat at my desk at the courthouse, watching the digital confirmation wheel spin on my computer screen before it finally settled on a green checkmark. It was a simple transaction, a few clicks of a mouse, but it felt like watching water disappear down a drain. I knew where that money was going. It wasn't going to a venue coordinator or a florist. It was going straight into the pockets of Richard and Eleanor Sterling, a desperate band-aid on a gaping financial wound they had hid from my daughter, and that my daughter had tried to hide from me. Clara walked into our office carrying a fresh pot of black coffee. She didn't ask if I'd done it. She just looked at my face, set the pot down on a cork trivet, and poured me a mug. "You're going tonight, aren't you?" she asked quietly, her eyes searching mine behind her reading glasses. "I have to, Clara," I said, my voice barely louder than the hum of the overhead lights. "They're holding the rehearsal dinner at the Catawba Island Yacht Club, the very dinner my $5,000 just saved. I want to see what my money bought. In quote, I want them to see who actually paid for it. If you've ever had to steel yourself to walk into a room where you know you aren't wanted, you know the cold, heavy preparation that goes into it. You don't put on armor, you put on your dignity. I went home after my shift ended at 5. I didn't rush. I washed my face with cool water at my bathroom sink, looking at the lines around my eyes. Lines earned from years of worrying about mortgages, college tuitions, and the feverish nights when Chloe was a little girl. I didn't wear designer clothes. I didn't have any. Instead, I pulled a navy blue knit dress from my closet, the one I'd bought on sale at Macy's 5 years ago for a colleague's retirement dinner. It was simple, clean, and fit me well. I put on the single strand of cultured pearls my late husband, Thomas, had given me for our 10th anniversary. They weren't large, and they certainly weren't perfect, but they were real. I placed the worn brown leather folder containing the foreclosure documents into my canvas tote bag. I didn't need a fancy leather briefcase to carry the truth. The Catawba Island Yacht Club was glowing like a lantern against the darkening Ohio sky when I pulled my 10-year-old Chevy Impala into the parking lot. The wind off Lake Erie was ferocious now, carrying the scent of deep, cold water and the sharp tang of early spring rain. I bypassed the young valet driver who looked at my peeling steering wheel cover with polite confusion, parking the car myself in the very back row next to a dumpster. I didn't mind the walk. the cold air cleared my head. As I walked up the manicured stone path toward the clubhouse, the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses drifted through the heavy glass double doors. The lobby smelled of polished mahogany, expensive perfume, and prime rib. A hand-lettered chalkboard sign stood near the entrance, decorated with white silk orchids. Asterisk private event. Chloe and Julian's rehearsal dinner. Asterisk. I walked toward the private dining room at the back of the club. The room was beautiful, I had to admit. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the marina, where millions of dollars of yachts bobbed in the dark water. The tables were draped in heavy white linen, lit by flickering votive candles. And there, in the center of the room, was my daughter. Chloe looked radiant. She was wearing a white lace cocktail dress, her hair swept up in an elegant style that made her look older, more sophisticated, and entirely like a stranger. She was laughing, her hand resting lightly on the arm of Julian Sterling. Julian was handsome in a soft, privileged way, wearing a blue blazer and gray slacks, his smile perfectly practiced. And sitting at the head of the table, holding court with glasses of champagne, were Richard and Eleanor Sterling. They didn't look like people who were facing eviction. They looked like royalty, nodding benevolently as the guests toasted their son. I know some of you reading this might think I was being cruel by showing up uninvited. You might think a mother should just swallow her pride and let her daughter have her moment, even if it's built on a foundation of lies. But let me ask you this. If you saw your child running toward the edge of a crumbling cliff, would you stay quiet just because she liked the view on the way down? I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the canvas tote bag hanging from my shoulder. It was Chloe who saw me first. The laughter died on her lips, and her face went completely white. She set her champagne glass down so hard that some of the sparkling liquid sloshed over the rim, pooling on the white tablecloth. She whispered something to Julian, then quickly navigated her way through the tables toward me, her heels clicking rapidly on the hardwood floor. "Mom!" she hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me into the shadow of a decorative pillar near the entrance. Her grip was tight, her fingers shaking. "What are you doing here? I told you this was a private dinner. Julian's parents. They decided not to go to Europe after all because of a change in Julian's schedule. I told you it would be awkward." "I know what you told me, Chloe," I said, my voice calm, steady, and entirely devoid of anger. "But I wanted to see where my $5,000 went. The money you said was a short-term loan because of Julian's father's international wire transfer issues." Chloe flinched, her eyes darting nervously back toward the main table. "Mom, please, don't do this here. I'll pay you back next week, I swear. You need to leave. If Julian's parents see you like this, in that dress, carrying a canvas bag, they're going to ask questions. They think we come from a different background." "A different background, Chloe?" I asked, looking her directly in the eyes. "You mean a background where we pay our bills? Where we don't live in a house we don't own, pretending to be wealthy while dodging the sheriff's deputy?" Before Chloe could process my words, a sharp, aristocratic voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here, Chloe dear?" Eleanor Sterling had glided over from the main table, her champagne flute held delicately between her manicured fingers. She looked at me, her eyes widening in sudden, horrified recognition as she realized I was the clerk who had stood on her front porch on Catawba Island just hours earlier. "You!" Eleanor gasped, her voice dropping its polite veneer. "Richard? Richard, come here immediately!" Richard Sterling rose from his chair, his brow furrowing as he walked toward us. Julian followed closely behind, his handsome face clouding with irritation. Within seconds, we were surrounded, a small, tense circle of conflict in the corner of the glittering dining room. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, his voice a low, threatening growl. He looked at me, then at the canvas tote bag on my shoulder. "I told your office that we are handling our financial restructuring through Raymond Vance. You have no right to harass us at a private family event. This is highly unprofessional." Chloe looked back and forth between us, her eyes wide with mounting terror. Mom, what is he talking about? Why does Julian's dad know you? What office? Richard sneered, looking down his nose at my daughter. Your mother, Chloe, is a low-level courier or clerk from the predatory private trust that has been harassing our family over a minor administrative dispute regarding our estate. She showed up at our home today acting like an officer of the court. I should have her fired for this. Julian stepped forward, his jaw clenched. Is this a joke? Chloe, you told us your mother was a quiet woman who worked in local government. You didn't tell us she was some bitter collections agent who doesn't know her place. The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly, designed to humiliate, designed to put the simple Sandusky title clerk back in her box. I looked at my daughter. I saw the shame, the confusion, and the sudden, sickening realization dawning in her eyes. She looked at me, then at the Sterlings, and for the first time in her life, she saw the true cost of the world she had tried so hard to buy into. I reached into my canvas tote bag. My hands were slow, deliberate, and perfectly steady. I pulled out the worn brown leather folder that had belonged to my late husband, Thomas. I unzipped it, the sound of the metal teeth sliding open sounding like a small, sharp crack in the quiet corner of the room. I pulled out the blue-backed foreclosure documents. I didn't hand them to Richard. I didn't hand them to Eleanor. I opened the folder and laid them flat on the small, polished console table next to the pillar, right beneath a vase of imported white orchids. I am not a courier, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, freezing resonance that seemed to expand, silencing the low chatter of the nearby tables, and I am not a collections agent. I pointed a single, dry finger at the signature line at the bottom of the asterisk notice of acceleration asterisk. My name is Vivian Miller Carter, I said, looking Richard Sterling dead in the eye. I am the sole trustee of the Miller Carter Family Trust, the trust established by my father, Arthur Miller, the trust that currently holds the $450,000 mortgage on your estate, the mortgage that has been in default for 7 months. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard Sterling's face went from the flush of expensive champagne to the gray of wet cement. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Beside him, Eleanor let out a small, strangled gasp, her champagne flute tilting dangerously in her hand. Mom? Chloe whispered, her voice cracking, her hand flying to her mouth. What? What are you saying? I'm saying, Chloe, I said, turning my gaze to my daughter, my heart aching but my voice remaining firm, that the family you thought was too elite for your working-class mother is currently living in a house that I have the legal authority to repossess. I'm saying that the $5,000 you begged me for today didn't go to a venue coordinator. It went to keep these people from having a foreclosure notice posted on their gate before your wedding. I looked back at Richard and Eleanor, who looked as though they had just seen a ghost rise from the Lake Erie floor. The cure period has expired, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice as solid as the stone foundation of their decaying mansion. There will be no restructuring. There will be no extensions. The Miller Carter Trust is accelerating the debt. You have 30 days to produce $548,000, or the Sterling estate will be sold to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps. I zipped the brown leather folders shut with a single, smooth pull, the sound echoing like a final judgment in the silent room. The silence in that private dining room didn't just hang in the air. It pressed down on us like the heavy, humid heat before a Midwestern summer storm. I didn't wait to see the final collapse of the Sterling's dignity. I had said what needed to be said, laid the truth bare on that polished console table under the imported white orchids, and turned my back. As I walked out of the Catawba Island Yacht Club, the heavy glass doors closing behind me, I could hear the sudden, sharp outbreak of hushed, panicked arguing behind me. Julian's voice was rising, no longer smooth and polished, but thin and desperate. Eleanor was crying. I walked down the manicured stone path in the dark, the wind off Lake Erie whipping my hair across my face. I got into my 10-year-old Chevy Impala, my hands resting on the peeling steering wheel cover, and I just sat there in the dark parking lot for a long time. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked like what I was, a 54-year-old woman who had worked 30 years in a basement archives room, whose husband was in the ground, and whose daughter had tried to lock her out of her life. I felt the tears then, hot and stinging, slipping down my cheeks. I let them come. You see, I know some of you might think that holding this kind of power makes you feel invincible. But the truth is, when the person you are standing up to is your own child, winning feels a lot like losing. It's a quiet, hollow ache in the center of your chest, and no amount of legal paperwork or financial leverage can make it go away. The next morning, I was back at my desk at the courthouse by 8 o'clock. My eyes were a little puffy, but my cardigan was pressed and my coffee was hot. Clara didn't ask me a single question when she saw me. She just walked over to my desk, set a small plate with a homemade blueberry muffin next to my keyboard, and gave my shoulder a firm, lingering squeeze. That is the beauty of old friends. They don't need the details to know when your soul is bruised. By 10 o'clock, the legal machinery was in full motion. Raymond Vance called me from Cleveland, his voice brisk and professional. We filed the formal acceleration notice with the county recorder's office this morning, Vivian. It's official. The Sterlings have exactly 30 days to cure the default, or the property goes to sheriff's sale. Given their outstanding tax liens and civil judgments, there is no bank in the state of Ohio that will lend them a dime. They are finished. Thank you, Raymond, I said, staring at the yellowing map of Sandusky hanging on my office wall. Just let the process run its course. No shortcuts, but no exceptions either. The wedding, of course, did not happen. The illusion of the Sterling wealth evaporated faster than morning mist on the lake. Once Julian and his parents realized that the prominent Sandusky family they were trying to latch onto was actually the very source of their financial ruin, the engagement crumbled. But it wasn't just about the money. The moment the mask slipped, Chloe saw Julian for who he truly was, a weak, entitled boy who had been coached by his parents to find a wealthy girl to save their sinking ship. When Julian realized Chloe didn't have a trust fund of her own, and that I was holding the foreclosure papers, his charm turned into an ugly, venomous anger. He accused her of lying to him, of pretending to be something she wasn't, completely ignoring the fact that his own family was living on borrowed time in a house they didn't own. It took 3 days for Chloe to come home. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the evening sun casting long, amber shadows across the yellow laminate. The copper-bottomed tea kettle was just starting to whistle on the stove, a low, comforting hum that filled the quiet house. I heard the front door open, the screen door clicking shut with that familiar, hollow sound. Chloe walked into the kitchen. She looked exhausted. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, she wore no makeup, and she was carrying a single, battered suitcase, the same one she had taken to college 4 years ago. She stopped at the edge of the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen, looking at me with a mixture of fear and shame that broke my heart. If you have ever had your child stand before you, stripped of all their pride, knowing they have hurt you deeply, you know how hard it is to keep from running to them and pulling them into your arms. You want to wipe away the pain. You want to tell them it doesn't matter. But my father, Arthur Miller, had taught me a harder kind of love. He taught me that if you don't let people feel the weight of their own choices, they will never learn how to stand on their own 2 feet. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Stood up from the table, walked to the stove, and turned off the burner. The whistling of the kettle died down, leaving only the quiet tick of the wall clock. I poured the hot water into 2 mugs, placing a tea bag in each. "Sit down, Chloe," I said softly, gesturing to the chair opposite mine. She sat, her hands trembling as she reached for the mug. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the dented copper kettle resting on the stove. "Julian's father tried to get me to ask you for an extension," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After you left the yacht club, they were screaming at each other. Julian told me that if I loved him, I would make you sign the papers. He said that if I was a good daughter, I'd find a way to get the money from the trust. That's when I realized they didn't care about me at all. They just wanted a way out. I know, baby, I said, using the old nickname for the first time in years. I was so stupid, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I was so ashamed of this house, of your job, of everything you worked so hard for. I wanted to be like them. I wanted to look at the lake from a stone balcony and pretend I was better than everyone else. And the whole time, you were the one holding everything up. You paid my tuition, you saved my life today, and I treated you like a nuisance. I reached across the laminate table and placed my hand over hers. Her skin was cold, but she didn't pull away. She gripped my fingers, holding on to me like a drowning person climbs onto a raft. You weren't stupid, Chloe, I said, my voice steady but filled with emotion. You were young, and you let yourself be dazzled by things that don't have any weight. Wealth is like the water in the lake. It looks beautiful when the sun hits it, but if you try to build a house on it, you're going to drown. Real wealth is what sits quietly in the dirt. It's hard work, it's clean hands, and it's the people who love you when the lights go out. We sat there for a long time, drinking our tea in the quiet kitchen as the darkness settled over Sandusky. I didn't give Chloe a pass. I loved her too much for that. The next morning, we sat down at that same table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator. I told her that she would be living in her old room, but she would be paying me $300 a month in rent. I told her that the $5,000 I had transferred to her account was a formal loan, and we wrote out a repayment schedule, $50 a week, interest-free, until it was paid in full. She didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes clear and focused as she signed her name at the bottom of the yellow paper. 2 weeks later, the Sterling estate went to auction. There were no private buyers willing to take on the massive debt and the structural repairs the house desperately needed. So the Miller-Carter Family Trust bought the property back for the value of the outstanding mortgage. I didn't keep it. I had Raymond Vance list the property for sale immediately. It sold 3 months later to a regional park conservation group that wanted to turn the Eastern Cliff into a public nature preserve. The day the sale closed, I drove out to Catawba Island one last time. The wrought iron gates were gone, removed by the conservation crew to open the pathway for the public. The grand stone house was quiet, its windows reflecting the blue Ohio sky. I walked down to the edge of the cliff, looking out over the gray, endless expanse of Lake Erie. The wind was warm today, carrying the scent of summer clover and damp earth. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out my father's small, brass skeleton key. I didn't need it anymore. The cedar lockbox at home was locked, but the legacy he had left me wasn't in the box. It was in the strength of my own spine, in the quiet dignity of a life lived without pretense. I threw the key out into the water. It made a tiny, insignificant splash before disappearing into the deep, quiet gray. Chloe has been working at the local library for 6 months now. She's studying for her master's in library science, spending her evenings squinting at microfiche and digital databases, just like her mother did. She still lives in her old room, and every Friday, without fail, she places a $50 bill on my kitchen counter next to the copper-bottomed tea kettle. Our relationship isn't perfect. The hurts of the past don't vanish overnight, and there are still moments when a quiet, guarded distance sits between us at the dinner table. But it's an honest distance now, built on truth rather than illusions. Yesterday, she came home with a small white paper bag from the bakery near the pier. She set it on the table, pulled out 2 boxes of saltwater taffy, the $5 kind, and smiled at me. "I thought we could have these with our tea tonight, Mom," she said. I looked at the simple paper box, then up at my daughter's clear, honest eyes. "I'd like that, Chloe," I said. "I'd like that very much.